Welcome to the Todd DeVoe Show, exploring the best ideas and lessons for leaders.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are at in this fine land. And I just want to say thank you to Buffalo Computer Graphics and D-Land for sponsoring the Todd DeVoe Show in this particular episode with Climb and Lift. So the Climb and Lift episode here, empowering and building confidence as women public speakers in the emergency management field. And, you know, one of the things that we need to be supporting generally as emergency managers and those of us that want to see the field grow is, you know, getting diverse opinions into the field. And this is one of the things that Ashley's been working on. So Ashley, welcome to the Todd DeVoe Show.
All right. Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Absolutely. And, you know, the Climb and Lift series, I think, is really important. You know, when Carol Seawick asked me if I would consider doing this, I was like, absolutely, because bringing diverse viewpoints into emergency management, I think, is critical, and I think it's exciting. But you're doing some of the same stuff with Empower. Talk about what exactly is Empower, and like how did you get it started?
Yeah, so I met with a group of my women colleagues in the Baltimore and DC area with an idea to basically create a safe space for women in emergency management to meet. We wanted to create monthly network events, happy hours. We also wanted to highlight women leaders because we know that there aren't a ton of women in executive level and director level emergency management. And so some of us have a passion and a desire to want to pursue that. So we wanted an opportunity to highlight that as well. And then lastly, we wanted a group that we could actually put on seminars and promote different leadership skills to women, including some tough topics about, salary negotiation and things like that to really promote the growth of women in emergency management.
What's it mean to see the FEMA being led by Deanna Criswell?
Amazing. I actually remember just a few years ago, a lot of us talking about how there's never been a woman and that we would really love to see a woman. And so I think it's so great to see that at the upper level head of FEMA. And I really hope we can continue to see more women in leadership positions.
Why is that important?
I think it's important because we really need role models. And that's kind of another goal of Empower as well, is, like I said, trying to identify who's already gotten to the top, who's up there, so we can look up to them. I think a lot of us do really want to lead, and we want the opportunity to step in that role, but sometimes it can be very intimidating, especially if you're in a room and you don't see anybody like you.
I find this interesting, and I'm going to ask this question in that when you're looking at colleges, right? You're looking at colleges. There's more women in college than there are men right now. But on the other side of it, there are more men enrolled in the STEM, and I know that you come from the STEM world. Even though there's more women by almost like 25% enrolled in colleges, but there's more men enrolled in STEM. Why is that?
I think there's been some research done on how gender roles and kind of gender assessment of what careers are palpable for someone actually occur in childhood. And so they've talked to a lot of elementary students, and it seems to me like a lot of girls don't think that they can do STEM. They kind of identify science and mathematics and all of that with male scientists and not female. And so starting young and not being able to see a female role model or see yourself in that field automatically makes you feel like you can't do it and you pick something else. So another aspect that I'm really passionate about is promoting women in STEM and trying to do outreach events in elementary school and in school to show people that they can come and do those things. Because I feel like if you can visualize yourself there as a young child, then of course you're going to pursue it and know it's possible when you're older in school.
And when it comes to emergency management and the thought leaders, right, and the people who are writing, we've seen in the past with Delaware, for instance, with the Disaster Resilience Center, with Colorado State or Colorado with the Natural Hazard Center. They've been led by women for a long time, when it comes to research. But however, it's been more like on the sociology side of emergency management, if you will, like on that research. Um, why do you think it's been so long for that to translate into women leading in the higher levels of emergency management?
That's a really good, thoughtful question. Being that I've just been in practitioner emergency management for a while and also in different regions, I still personally think some of it has to do with the fact that women aren't necessarily leading or prevalent in first response either, or public safety. And since public safety tends to feed into local level emergency management and other realms, it's still a challenge to get a lot of women in the pool of emergency management as a career. Outside of that, I still think too, it's challenging to step up and lead, especially like I said, if you feel like you're in a room and you're different, or you don't fit in, or you feel like there could be stereotypes. So sometimes it's hard to want to step out of that shell and take that on. And then two, I just think that, in some situations, we just don't get opportunities to. So I'm really glad that, our field is evolving. We're seeing more women given leadership opportunities and opportunities to be vocal. And I think that it'll do nothing but grow our field and make us more successful.
So IAM right now, Carolyn is leading the charge. Our next president's going to be female. Then we're going to have a man come in, Justin, and then the president after that's going to be female. So realistically, IAM is being top down, is pretty heavy female led. Is that important to you?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I'm going to go back to the role models. I think it's just important to see different women in all levels of emergency management at all different supervisory and executive positions. It's nice to be able to see it so you can know you can do it. It's nice to be able to have someone to talk to who is well versed in leadership, experienced in it, and can also give you feedback as you really work to enhance what that might look like for you if you want to pursue that.
So how do we see change happening, not just with females, right? I mean, that's important, right? But how do we see change completely happening in emergency management going forward? Because one of the things I've been standing on my soapbox for a long time is saying, hey, we need to have emergency managers that come from the background of going to school for emergency management to become emergency managers. And I'm a retread, so I'm just as guilty as that. I started out as in public safety and then went into emergency management, so I call myself a retread, like a lot of us are. How do we encourage people from the ground up to get into emergency management? And what are you guys doing? I say you guys, all the people that are younger. I'm an old guy now, right? And actually, you're in the new leadership. What are you all doing to ensure that we're seeing a proper change in the field of emergency management?
So I'm going to kind of echo what I always say is I kind of agree with you in the sense that we really need field standardization. So a solid pathway into what our profession is, a definition of what emergency management is and what skills and education is required. And then, a more formal process of assessing what an entry-level emergency manager looks like as opposed to a director-level emergency manager. So I think if we continue to build that, not only from state to state, nationally, and then also locally, that's going to help a ton because we can actually identify who's coming in, what backgrounds they have, and things like that. I kind of echo education. I think education is really important, especially as we encounter a lot of challenges of the field, looking at climate change, evolving threats, cyber. I really think education is super important. And then lastly, I think we can only really recruit diversity and additions to our field by doing more outreach and engagement about what emergency management is. I mean, it's hard for us to kind of sit back and think that children and college students are going to fall into emergency management if most of a majority of the population don't even know what emergency management is and they don't know that we exist. So I really think that we need to do more education and outreach, not only to high schools, but just to people in general, just like we've been trying to do with National Preparedness Month and other initiatives that we have in our communities.
Yeah, I always think it's funny, not funny, but ironic, right? Everybody knows what a firefighter does or a police officer does, paramedic or EMT, right? They see these trucks with lights and sirens on. And when you say, oh, what do you do for a living? You say, oh, I'm an emergency manager. And they're like, oh, okay, what's that? And the only thing that we could say where people have an understanding is like, well, we're like FEMA, but we're just at the local level, right? And they understand FEMA because they've seen the news. And it seems to be the only time emergency management is in the news, though, is when it like really screws up, like Katrina, for instance, or along those lines. The issues that happened over with Hurricane Maria over Puerto Rico. But we don't get the accolades when things go well. What can we do to change that?
I think it's really funny what you said about FEMA, because every time I do any kind of outreach, that's exactly what I tell people, including like partners. If I'm brand new with working with them, or even the public, I tell them I'm the FEMA, but of the county. So I think really what we need to do is just keep doing outreach more than in the middle of the incident or during recovery. But I think that's also a challenge because a lot of our offices are very short staffed. So it's hard to find the time to get out there, but I think it's really essential to what we do. People are never going to know who to contact, who to reach out to, any of the services that we do or anything that we're trying to provide without that outreach. So we really need to up that. And I really think too, kind of growing the public information positions within emergency management offices would really help us. Currently, we have a lot of OEM offices that typically use like a police PIO, a fire PIO, or even just the local comms as their PIO. And that works during incidents, but we lose a lot of that everyday education that police and fire get to take advantage of with that dedicated PIO person constantly doing outreach from their office.
Yeah, I think, on the other side too is like you think of the days at the schools, elementary schools, and they, of course, the kids love it because they bring in the fire truck and do fire truck stuff, and they bring in the police car that always looks cool with lights and sirens. But they never, even during National Preparedness Month, I don't recall. Maybe somebody out there has, and I'd like to hear about it. Been invited to go talk to the local elementary school to talk about disaster preparedness, right? They'll bring in the fire prevention person to talk about disaster preparedness and not the emergency manager. I think that's, how do we change that? I mean, I think that's an interesting conversation.
Some offices are really starting to grow their offices and recruit and actually have dedicated like community engagement staff. I think that that's a huge first step because once again, like we really need to get into the community and we really need to focus on outreach. But in an office that only has a couple people, I mean, you're never going to be able to do that if you've got plans, T&E, and everything else you're supposed to be doing. So I think really first step is making sure that we do that. And then carrying that out and actually going out to set up events. I think that sometimes we wait too long to be approached to go and host something, and we probably need to put more manpower into setting stuff up and getting out there.
I know the state of California is working on something as I think about this, but they're not teaching the course. They've created a curriculum for fourth graders, for fourth grade teachers, not the fourth graders, for fourth grade teachers to teach in their classroom, which I think is a great step forward. And they do have like a virtual tour of the Emergency Operations Center. I think that's kind of neat, but it's still not, local emergency managers going out and doing it. I think that's the side of it that we need to do is have those in the city. And I know you're busy, and I'm not trying to put extra burden on you, but if we really want to do something with National Preparedness Month, I think getting out there to the classrooms and working with our local elementary schools and middle schools, because those seem to be the areas where we can really make a difference. And they did the study. The study says fourth grade is where you can make the biggest difference. So, that being said as well. So I forgot about that. But yeah, California's been doing some cool stuff with that. Now let's talk about colleges here, for instance. So IEM has been working hard on getting college chapters for emergency management, and some schools that have EM programs are embracing it. But what about all these schools that have allied, like you come from meteorology, right? Well, probably a little bit more depth than that, but just for these basic guys like myself, so how do we reach out to people like you? I mean, let me ask the question this way. How did you find out about emergency management? Because you changed your career path.
I did. So when I went to school, I wanted to do meteorology and work for the National Weather Service and do forecasting. So I was super passionate about the public safety aspect of issuing watches and warnings and trying to reduce storm-related fatalities. I actually went to a conference, and it was a student-led conference for the American Meteorological Society, and they had a Florida State meteorologist working for the Florida State Emergency Management Agency, and she was doing a presentation on how she was focusing on doing weather-related information, but specific to the governor and for emergency management. And I thought that was the coolest thing. So I always had emergency management in like my back pocket. And then I found out that you got to do all of those cool decisions like evacuations and all of that stuff. And I was like, that is what I want to do with weather stuff. So to put things short, I found out through a conference and a meteorology conference because they're trying to really bridge the gap between emergency management and meteorology because they're so relevant.
Mm-hmm.
But I would love to see more IAM chapters in universities because that is actually how I got to the AMS conference. Is I was a member of the student-led AMS chapter at our university. So I think we could really recruit not only IAM attendance, just like I went to the AMS conference, but also students and interaction, just like we do in AMS in the meteorology field.
What fields do you think work well on the STEM side? Because that's I'm really curious about the STEM side right now with emergency management, because I really think there's a lot of crossover. Now I know like geology and plate tectonics really makes a lot of sense. You know, meteorology makes a lot of sense. What other STEM programs really fit well with emergency management?
Well, definitely a vote for meteorology. I always try to reach out to all of my fellow weather nerds and try to get them in the field because I think it's just so important to have that understanding of how the atmosphere works. So when you're making decisions that are high stakes, you trust yourself a little more. You understand it's not really like a guess on whether or not you're going to flood or not. But besides meteorology, geophysics, earth sciences, I personally think technology related stuff. So like computer science. Cyber is definitely not my strength coming from STEM, but if I could go back to school, I would have loved to take some computer science stuff so I could feel a little more well versed with that.
Yeah, I agree with you there with the computer stuff because that's becoming a huge issue. I shouldn't say becoming, it has been for a long time. We just are learning more about it now. Mark asked a question. It said, how do we capitalize on the breadth and depth of opportunities in emergency management disciplines, not just government, right, but also private sector, higher education, public health, etc., which tend to be more diverse organizations by nature? That's a great question, Mark. What do you think, Ashley? How do we get people involved in other? Because like everybody thinks government, right? They go, okay, I want to be an emergency manager, and like we said, it's like FEMA for the county or FEMA for the city. How do we break that into? Hospitals use emergency managers, higher education, K through 12 now has emergency management positions that are opening up. You're seeing them in social services as well, which makes sense, and also, nonprofit organizations and private businesses. I mean, when you have Tesla and Facebook or Meta, Disney, Uber, all these, big Airbnb, they all have emergency management positions. How do we get those people involved, or how do we get people involved in those positions?
That's a really good question. And I was actually thinking of multiple ways to kind of discuss that question. So you can kind of talk about either how you're going to recruit and train for all of these different diverse emergency management positions, but clearly dealing with different companies and different things, but also like even outreach. So like, we put a lot of weight on our local level emergency management to get out and do those things like schools. But why don't we reach out to our partners in hospitals and other things and use our emergency management networks to improve outreach or even work together to reach the different niches that we're in? So that's very interesting. I'm glad that he brought that up. I think for probably career standardization, he brings up a good point. Like I said, it's kind of hard to require a standard on all of these diverse different things outside of just that base level planning, training, exercise, all of the basic stuff. So yeah, I don't know if I have a really good answer for that.
You know what I find interesting too is when we talk about emergency management in general, everybody just automatically goes into like we talk about on the government side, and we focus a lot on the response, right? It's always like when we do exercises, it's always okay, responding to this like great disaster, first few hours of it, whatever, and then we pat ourselves on the back and say we did a great job, and, whether we did or not, and that's a whole other story. But we don't really get into like, I mean, I guess it's kind of hard to drill mitigation, right? But we tend not to, it's not sexy, I guess, for lack of a better term, going into like mitigation or going into prevention or going into, those type of things. How do we really engage people to get into those positions outside of response?
I think, first of all, we need to make sure that our field has a paradigm shift to include all four realms of the cycle of emergency management, because there are still a lot of regions and areas and offices that still do just prepare for the response. They don't really necessarily do whole community planning. Outreach isn't really a thing. Mitigation definitely isn't a thing. And recovery occurs when it has to. Right. So I think we need to make sure as a field we're doing that first, and then have standards that we're training people in all things. Obviously, we're very good at response because we typically, or used to, pull responders into the field. So that's kind of their mode. And I mean, I know fire departments and other public safety agencies do preparedness. They do equipment checks and things like that. But they're very accustomed to sitting back and waiting for that call to go do something, which is kind of what you see in emergency management. So I just think we need to have that paradigm shift in the field first, establish standards so we're training on all four realms and implementing it correctly, and staffing to where we can do all four realms, and then educating the new people who come in through university or whatever else that we're making sure to do all four realms.
I find interesting too is like, I had an intern that was working for me, and he asked me if he could work on business emergency management, and he was creating flyers and program information to work with the Chamber of Commerce. I hooked him up with the chamber, and they were doing stuff for small businesses. And that's one of the things I think is interesting, is like, we understand that the Walmarts, the Targets, the big box stores, they're going to do okay after a disaster. But our mom and pop shops, Main Street shops, they really need a lot of help. And I think focusing on trying to build partnerships with them early on, in the build that relationship with them early on before disaster occurs, is critical to their survival after disaster. How can we do more of that?
I'm a huge fan of networking, or even just building networks in your community. So at one point I was able to do that with a bunch of our houses of worship. So we had kind of a faith network where we sent letters out. We did a preparedness seminar with them to kind of promote emergency planning in houses of worship. And then we also did roundtable meetings. So they would come back in a couple months with their plan. We would ask or answer questions with them and always be that resource for them. Never writing their plan for them, but helping them engage in the process. That was really successful because we were able to make all those partnerships and then have an email list. So if I had an incident and maybe I was looking for help from houses of worship, I could send information about the incident through that network. And then they in turn could hit all of their networks. And so I'm a big fan of that networking thing. And I think that we could do the same with schools, making sure that you have public, private schools and everybody. Daycare, childcare, making sure that they're in their little network. Small businesses, and even some larger agencies have, BEOCs, where they're making the connections with businesses and using that as a platform to get the information to help them respond and recover. So I really think that's kind of the key, is creating the network so we can disseminate information through, and then it's almost like a web of all these different relationships we have in our community.
Do you think getting more women involved, and minorities too, for that matter, but getting involved into emergency management will open the doors to the community more than all of us old first responders that that are crusty and like to just do response?
Yes, absolutely. I think, like we kind of have said over the past few years about diversity in emergency management, we really need to represent what our communities look like. We don't need to all just look the same way and then try to connect with people who don't. So the more women, the more diversity that we can have, I really think that's going to improve our reach. Also, I like to really tout whole community planning because it's important to listen to people with different experiences and backgrounds when we're trying to build how people are going to react, respond, and recover. My experience is not the same as someone else that's not me. And so I want to make sure that I'm listening to that community. So I really think if we can improve diversity, not only in planning, but also in our outreach and our engagement, it's really just going to make our response plans and our work a lot better.
I think that's critical too, is when you're looking at the whole community. That's one of the things I've been pushing out for a long time now, with the idea of disaster resilient communities, or anti-fragile communities, is what I like to say now, because I think the concept of resiliency has been really kind of become a mushy word. You've mentioned this a couple times with that whole community. What does a whole community approach look like to you?
So I kind of dream of a whole community approach, like in a planning realm, of making sure that you have representation of everyone at your table. For instance, if you're trying to do access and functional needs, then you need to definitely have folks directly related from that community in that planning meeting, or providing stakeholder insight, or bouncing ideas off of them. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense for me to build AFN transportation plan when I've never been AFN. So I really just think making sure you have different people from different backgrounds, different levels at that table. Local, state, federal, government, nonprofit, business, private, but resident. I think it's so important that we start to actually bring residents into our community planning and have them contribute ideas of what they want to see through guided discussions.
I'm going to ask a question here that's kind of controversial, and I know we only have a couple minutes left, so it's going to be hard to delve too deep into it. But it seems to be like we are afraid, I say the collective we, are afraid to engage our disaster plans with the residents. How do we change that?
I think it's kind of similar to what you see sometimes with public information, how we're afraid to put information out about our response, or afraid to be proactive because we automatically think it'll be taken negatively. When it's really opposite, because if I don't put it out there, then it makes me look like I'm trying to hide something. I think that we really need to just kind of embrace transparency and embrace the concept of wanting to bring people into our circles and educate. I will say there's always going to be that issue, though, of, Homeland Security or even threats with certain plans. And I've encountered that, like with LEPC planning and other things, where we didn't feel comfortable telling all of our plans to the public. And while I understand the value of that in protecting critical infrastructure information, I still think we can still educate the public on what our plans are and what to expect from us. And it's also going to save the day when we have the disaster, because they understand better. They know that we're not going to knock on their door and hand deliver water. They're going to know that our plan is to set up a distribution site.
Yeah. Outreach to me is the hardest thing that I've ever done, because people sometimes don't want to hear what we're talking about, or they just want to stay inside that bubble. And I think breaking down those bubbles is the hard part. But that's a whole nother conversation for another day. We have a minute left, and I want to give it to you. How can people find you and find out, and how can people get more involved with Empower?
Yes, so Empower, we actually are doing monthly networking events, like I said, and we've actually been doing some virtual Zoom events with guest speakers. And so if anyone's interested in staying up to date with that, we have a Twitter at NCR Empower is the handle. We also have a LinkedIn page, which is Empower. We are the Mid-Atlantic chapter, which is the only chapter at this time, but we're hoping to expand sometime. You can also follow me at Miss Ashes 92 on Twitter, or find me on LinkedIn. And if anyone has any questions or interests about Empower, you can send me an email or send me a DM, and we can definitely get you all hooked up.
Yeah, definitely follow her Twitter, because she puts out great information, and sometimes it's funny too.
Lots of planning peas.
Yeah, lots of cool stuff. I do enjoy reading your Twitter posts, that's for sure. Hey, thank you, Ashley. Thank you so much for being here. I wish we had longer time to go on this, but we only have the half hour today. But I'd love to have you back on sometime.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I think it was a really great discussion, and just thank you so much again.
Absolutely. I'll talk to you a little bit. Hey, everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. I think these conversations are critical. I'll tell you, as an old guy here in the emergency management, supporting the next generation coming up, and Ashley is supporting the generation coming up behind her. I think it's critical for us to do this, and I'm really excited to see what you guys are all doing. Next time around. Ashley, again, thank you so much for spending time with us. And everybody, please spread the word about National Preparedness Month. Spread the word about what we're doing. I think we're doing some great work. And until next time, stay safe, stay hydrated.